Good morning, everyone, and welcome to week 9. This week we're going to discuss geologic time and fossils, and then next week in lab you'll do some exercises to determine geologic time based on geologic evidence. So why is it important to have a time scale and to take note of geologic time when studying geology? Well, it's because rocks record geologic and evolutionary changes throughout Earth's history, and without a time perspective, these events have very little meaning. For example, if geologists looked at the rock record and found fossils of dinosaurs and thought that those fossils of dinosaurs came from after fossils of humans were found in the rock record, then we would think that humans and dinosaurs occupied the Earth at the same time. But given geologic findings of fossils and dating of said fossils, we have I think, a pretty solid understanding that dinosaurs existed before humans and that our time on this planet did not overlap with them. So there are like two primary ways to date geologic events. You can think of them as numerical dating and relative dating. Numerical dates specify the number of years that have passed since an event occurred. For example, you might have a sample of limestone and say, this sample of limestone is 250 million years old. And we'll get to how exactly you might determine that age later in this lecture. And then relative dating simply places rocks in a sequence of formation. For example, you might say that the Hermit Shale Formation is older than the Coconino Sandstone Formation. And we'll talk about how to determine the relative dates of rock formations as well as the numerical dates. So this is a photograph of the Grand Canyon and a demonstration of the principle of superposition. So if you look out over the Grand Canyon, you'll see a number of layers of primarily sedimentary rock. And the further you go down in the Grand Canyon, the older that sedimentary rock is. And the higher up in the Grand Canyon you are, the closer to modern day land elevation outside of the canyon, but near the canyon, the younger the rock is. So here on the right, you can see a geologist sketch of these different layers of rock. So you have sandstone, siltstone, and shale, and then you have shales and siltstones, and then you have a sandstone, and then you have primarily a limestone, and then a different formation of limestone, all stacked on top of one another. So this tells us the age of the rock, and then the type of rock tells us what was going on Earth in this location when that rock was formed. So for example, some of the limestone comes from a shallow sea being at this location in the past, versus the sandstone, siltstone, and shale may be from other events in this location in geologic history. So the second principle in relative dating that you should be aware of is the principle of original horizontality. And this principle simply states that layers of sediment are generally deposited in a horizontal position. So it basically means, when layers of sediment are deposited, they're usually not deposited vertically on top of one another. They're originally deposited horizontally on Earth's surface. And as a result of this, we know that rock layers that are flat, when we look at them, have not been disturbed, versus rock layers that appear folded or appear at an angle where they're not, the layers aren't parallel to Earth's surface, then we know that those might have been disturbed since they were originally deposited. The next principle of relative dating is the principle of lateral continuity. And this principle just states that beds originate as continuous layers that extend in all directions until they eventually thin out or grade into a different sediment type. So when you're thinking about the principle of original horizontality, a layer of sediment being deposited in one location only goes so far, right? Because the geologic processes that are bringing sediment to that location before it forms into a rock are only bringing so much sediment into that location. So for example, if we think about a lake bed and how that lake bed might be receiving a lot of silt and clay, and how that might ultimately turn into shale as it gets buried deeper and deeper in the earth. Well, the lake's only so big. So on the edges of where that lake used to exist, the layers that were originally deposited horizontally thin out or grade into a different sediment type. So that's one example of the principle of lateral continuity and sort of those layers continuing laterally until the formation would no longer exist because of the geologic processes that fed sediment to that location when the rocks were formed. So this photograph is a pretty good example of what the principle of original horizontality can tell you about a rock formation. So if we assume that these rocks that we were looking at were originally deposited horizontally, then you may note that a very significant amount of folding has occurred to this rock formation. You can see the different layers of red and white in the rock, and folding is caused by plate tectonic forces. For example, if you have something like India colliding with Eurasia, or the Asian side of Eurasia, obviously, then the pressure of that landmass colliding with the other landmass might create a situation where you see folding like this. But we know from the principle of original horizontality that this didn't used to look like this, and so therefore we know something about the geologic history of this rock. So this slide shows a really good example of both the principle of original horizontality and the principle of lateral continuity. If you look at the top part of the diagram, if you imagine this to be a lake basin or an ocean basin that sediment is being deposited into over time, you can see in the middle of the diagram that each layer is being deposited flat or horizontal to each additional layer. So that's the principle of original horizontality. Then on the left side, you can see that the layer ends by thinning at the margin of the sedimentary basin, or at the margin of the lake or ocean in this case. And you can imagine that the reason why is because the shape of the sedimentary basin dictates that those layers of sediment would thin, and the energy near the coast or the shore in this case won't allow as much sediment to be, or won't allow significantly more sediment to be built up on the edge than is built up in the middle of this lake or ocean. And then on the right side, you can see that the layers of sediment end by grading into a different kind of sediment. So if you imagine that middle layer, orange or pink looking layer, to be sandstone formed from sand being buried and lithified, then maybe further to the right there, you could imagine that being limestone. And that might be because a different type of sediment was being carried that far out into the lake or the ocean than was being carried out to the portions of the lake or ocean that are closer to the shore. Either that or the shore existed at a completely different location at that time, resulting in the layer ending by grading into a different kind of sediment or rock. And the principle, if we move down on this slide to the lower portion of the slide, the principle of lateral continuity allows us to infer that layers were originally continuous across this canyon. So when you see a canyon carved by a river or a glacier, for example, and you see layers of rock on either side, understanding that those layers were originally deposited horizontally and then continued laterally until the layer ended by thinning or grading into a different sediment, then we can pretty safely infer that these layers were originally continuous across the canyon without seeing the upper portion of this slide. So if you're walking through the Boise River Valley near Lucky Peak Reservoir, and you see on one side of the valley a layer of basalt, and on the other side of the valley a layer of basalt, and they're at approximately the same elevation, then you can determine that that is all one layer and it's just been cut through by the forces of erosion as a result of the river. The next relative dating principle that's important to discuss is the principle of cross-cutting relationships. And this principle just states that younger features cut across older features. So if you have an old layer of sedimentary rock and you see a basalt dike that cuts through that layer of sedimentary rock, then because it cuts through it, you can determine that the basalt is the younger feature out of the two, for one example. Another important principle is the principle of inclusions. So before I tell you what that is, inclusions are fragments of one rock unit that are enclosed within another rock unit. So the reasons why this might happen is if you have a basin full of sand, and then that basin full of sand is within a canyon, and there's some sort of a rock slide, for example, then those larger rocks would fall into the sand and then ultimately end up contained in a sandstone layer if that sand continues to get buried and becomes lithified into sandstone. Well, if something like that is to happen, you know that the rock containing the inclusion is younger, because for one rock to fall into sediment that has not yet formed into a rock, then the rock that fell into the sediment had to have existed before that sediment formed into a sedimentary rock. I hope that makes sense. So this photo shows a really good example of what I was just talking about with basalt dikes, for example. In this case, you have what appears to be granite or granodiorite, and then you have either basalt or andesite or some sort of volcanic rock clearly cutting through that granite or granodiorite. And because it cuts through, you can safely say that the darker rock in this photo, the dikes, are younger than the surrounding rock, and vice versa. So another principle of relative dating that's important to discuss are unconformities. So before I talk about unconformities, just know that layers of rock that have been deposited without interruption are called conformable layers. And an unconformity is a break in the rock record produced by non-deposition, or times when sediment was not being deposited, and erosion of rock units. So we know that both deposition and erosion occur in the natural world. When erosion is occurring and there's not a net deposition of sediment at a location, you end up with an unconformity in the rock record. There are three basic types of unconformities: an angular unconformity, a nonconformity, and a disconformity. So Sicker Point here in Scotland shows a really good example of an angular unconformity. So we can see in this photograph that above the unconformity you have gently dipping beds of reddish sandstone and conglomerate. And then below the unconformity you have nearly vertical beds of sandstone and shale. So the reason why this is called an angular unconformity is because you have this break in the rock record caused by non-deposition and erosion, which is an unconformity, but it's angular because the layers above the unconformity are deposited at a different angle than the layers below the unconformity. And this just is indicative of some sort of tectonic forces that were acting on the rock before the unconformity, causing them to currently be situated in a vertical manner, versus different tectonic forces acting on the rock after the unconformity, allowing the rock to be deposited closer to a horizontal or closer to parallel to the land surface. So again, as was demonstrated by the last slide, an angular unconformity is when tilted rocks are overlain by flat-lying rocks. And a disconformity is when sedimentary strata or beds on either side of the unconformity are parallel to one another. So if you have the principle of original horizontality, if the layers of sediment were being deposited horizontally or parallel to the land surface before and after the unconformity or the erosion event, then you're left with a disconformity. And then a nonconformity is when sedimentary strata or beds overlie metamorphic or igneous rocks. And this is caused by different geologic processes forming the rocks at one time in geologic history from another time in geologic history. And all three types of unconformities can be seen in the Grand Canyon, despite the fact that earlier in the lecture I said that most of the time you just see sedimentary strata in the Grand Canyon. There are also other types of rocks there as well, so you see nonconformities, disconformities, and angular unconformities in the Grand Canyon, which is a great place to study geology. So I'm going to show you a quick tutorial on the formation of an angular unconformity and how this might occur. So this slide shows a great example of how an angular unconformity might come to be. So if you look at this diagram, you're basically moving across time from a long time ago on the top diagram to, let's say, present on the bottom diagram. So if you imagine a lake basin or an ocean basin having sediment deposited into it, in this case, and that sediment becoming lithified into sedimentary rocks deeper within the basin, that would be the top diagram here. And then if you move forward in time, it looks like you have an event where you have an igneous intrusion, which is that gray formation on the bottom beneath the sedimentary formations here, that causes uplift, and it causes a fold in the sedimentary rock above as a result of the pressure being applied to one part of the sedimentary rock and not another because of the igneous intrusion. And then if you continue to move forward in time and you have erosion of that uplifted material, which usually uplifted material gets eroded faster than material in a valley, unless a river is cutting through that part of the valley. And so you're left with a few different mountain belts that exist as a result of that original uplift and folding and exposure of certain layers of rock that might be harder than other layers of rock. And then if you continue to move forward in time, you can see that this ocean basin or lake basin fills back in with sediment because you went from an environment of erosion back to an environment of deposition. And as a result, you're left with an angular unconformity where below the angular unconformity you have those older layers of sedimentary rock that were folded by the uplift, and above you have the newer layers of sedimentary rock that are abiding by the principle of original horizontality. And that's why if you were to see this series of sedimentary beds exposed, at the surface and you could see each layer, you'd be able to see the angular unconformity. So let's go back to the Grand Canyon so we can show examples of all three types of unconformities. So let's start at the bottom, or the oldest section of the Grand Canyon. And you can see a non-conformity here near the bottom, or here near the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, where you have the Vishnu Schist Formation, which is a metamorphic rock, if you recall. And then above that, you have the Tapete Sandstone and the Bright Angel Shale, which are sedimentary rocks. And you have a nonconformity there where you had a period of erosion of the Vishnu Schist, followed by deposition of the Tapete Sandstone. And then right next to that nonconformity, you can see an example of an angular unconformity. And this occurred because you had deposition of the Unkar group, which were sedimentary rocks. And those were deposited at an angle because of the way that the Vishnu Schist eroded, which was at an angle. And you can see that the Zoroaster granite eroded at an angle too there. Well, the angular layers of the Unkar group sedimentary rock are overlain by horizontal layers of the Tonto group sedimentary rock, or specifically the Tapete Sandstone and the Bright Angel Shale in this case. And so you have an example of an angular unconformity here because the Unkar group was being eroded for a time, and then you have the principle of horizontal original horizontality, dictating that the layers on top of that after the erosion event would be deposited horizontally and parallel to one another. Then moving up in the Grand Canyon, you can see an example of a disconformity where you have a layer of redwall sandstone overlain by the Sapphire group of sedimentary rocks. And in this case, you have sedimentary rocks, because limestone is a sedimentary rock, below and above the unconformity. And it's just that the limestone was eroded away before the deposition of the Sapphire group, and therefore it's called a disconformity. So let's apply some of the principles of relative dating in this tutorial.
This is Callan Bentley.
So let's apply some of the principles of
In this video, we're going to take a
relative
look
dating in
at
this
how you
tutorial.
deduce the geologic history of a region based on the principles of relative dating. And we're going to give you an opportunity to try your hand at it. So this is an image in your book that basically walks you through the many, many steps that you have to kind of think about in order to work out the geological history of a region. This is a hypothetical region. We've got this beautiful block diagram view of everything that's gone on. You want to walk your mind through this at least once or twice so that you get a sense of how these things work. And I'm sure you'll get an opportunity to practice this in lab if your class has a lab associated with it. So we want to end up here with this final block diagram, which is the most complex, but we're going to start by going with the simplest one. The simplest one is over here on the left part of the diagram, and you see it's basically just got several layers, A, B, C, and E. The letters here are somewhat arbitrary, but they end up basically giving a final sequence that is in order. So these are just sedimentary layers, deposition in some sort of a watery environment, perhaps. Okay, so here's where the D comes in. The D is coming in the form of a sill, and that sill is basically magma that intrudes between pre-existing sedimentary layers. So basically this magma oozes in between C and E and pops E upwards. Next up, we get the intrusion of a dike. That dike is labeled F, and it cuts across all the previous layers. So the principle of cross-cutting relationships tells us the dike has to be younger than everything else. Now we tilt all of our sedimentary layers away from horizontal, so they're now dipping off towards the left, and we erode rock off the top. If that whole block then subsides below sea level, new sedimentary layers can be deposited on top of that erosional surface. That produces an angular unconformity there. And so layers G, H, I, J, and K are above the unconformity surface, and every other layer, A through F, is below the unconformity. Finally, we bring that up to the surface, and you can see it is being etched out, so there's a new landscape forming on top, and the next chapter is being written. Okay, why don't you try your hand at it here? What's the sequence of events that would have to take place in order to produce this cross-section? Hopefully you identify that the green stuff down here at the bottom is probably going to be the oldest. You can see that with those squiggles and wiggles, that's likely metamorphic rock, so that's probably produced at the roots of some ancient mountain range. Then you'd have to bring that up to the surface and erode it off so that you could then end up depositing sedimentary layers on top of it. And so you deposit some sedimentary layers, call them 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the next step is going to be the intrusion of some igneous units. Now we've got several different igneous units here. We've got a dike here, let's call this dike A, and we've got a dike here, let's call that B, and we've got another dike over here called C, and then we've got this great big pluton, which we'll call D. So which of these came first? Well, you can see that C cuts across D, so it's got to be younger than D. D ends up cutting across this little offshoot of A, so D has got to be younger than A, and B cuts across A. So B's got to be younger than A. So A's got to be the oldest among these. So A cuts through our metamorphic rocks, it cuts through layer 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the next thing that's going to take place is going to be D. So D will go next, because D cuts across dike A. And then C cuts across D. Now, all of those then are basically brought to the surface and erosion takes place. So we end up basically producing an unconformity that goes across something like that. And that cuts across all those igneous units as well as our sedimentary units. After the unconformity, new units are deposited. Let's call them 5, 6, and 7. They're deposited on top as sedimentary layers. And then after that, we end up getting a fault. That fault breaks through all the units so far, and then the very last thing is the eruption of this volcano coming up through dike B, and then a lava flow coming onto the surface here. Notice that the lava flow is not offset along the fault. So that's the sort of thinking you need to employ in order to work out the geological history of a region. Thank you very much for your attention. This has been another Smart Figure.
Okay, so I hope you all understand the principles of relative dating and how to relatively date one geologic formation from another. And now we're going to move on to what most of you were probably most excited about this week, which is fossils. So I'm sure most of you know that fossils are traces or remains of prehistoric life preserved in rock. And paleontology is the study of fossils to determine the history of life on Earth. And knowing the nature of life that existed at a particular time helps researchers understand past environmental conditions. For example, if you find a fossil of a fish and you date that fossil to 20 million years old, then you can be pretty sure that a fish existed at that location 20 million years ago, and therefore that location used to have a lake or an ocean, depending on what type of fish we're talking about, or perhaps a river. So there are several different types of fossils because there are different ways that organisms can be preserved in the geologic record. One type is permineralization, and this is when mineral-rich groundwater flows through the porous tissue of the original organism, and that mineral-rich groundwater precipitates minerals. So one example of this is petrified wood. So for example, if you have an area where some trees fall for some reason into the sediment, and then those trees get buried in the sediment, and then ultimately mineral-rich groundwater flows through the porous tissue of those trees and precipitates minerals, then you're left with petrified wood. And this is the reason why, if you look at petrified wood, a lot of times you can actually see the structure of the original wood material. So for example, you might be able to see evidence of bark, or even evidence of tree rings or burn scars on the trees. Another type of fossils are molds and casts. So a mold is created when something is buried and then dissolved by underground water. So if you have a seashell that's buried in the sediment, and then that seashell is later dissolved by groundwater, then you're left with a mold, or basically a hole within the sedimentary rock. And that hole is the shape of the original organism, or in this case, a shell that I'm describing. And then a cast is created when the hollow spaces of the mold are filled. So you might have a situation where an organism was buried and then dissolved by groundwater, and then later mineral-rich groundwater flowed in and then filled the hollow space, creating a cast. Carbonization and impressions are other types of fossils. So carbonization happens when an organism is buried and then compressed by the addition of material on top of the organism. And that compression squeezes out gases and liquids from the organism, leaving a thin film of carbon on the rock. And this type of fossilization is pretty effective at preserving leaves and delicate animals. And then if the carbon film is lost because it is eroded away, sometimes impressions remain on the rock. And so this is a different type of fossil, and it's a little bit harder to see than the carbonization, because you don't have the color there still, but you do have the shape and structure of the organism still evidenced on the rock. Other types of fossils include amber. So many of you probably know that amber is the hardened resin of ancient trees. It comes from the sap, and it is effective at preserving insects. So any insects that land on or enter into trees may be preserved within the sap that ultimately becomes amber. And then lastly, we have trace fossils, which are indirect evidence of prehistoric life. So trace fossils are unique because you're not necessarily talking about preserving the original life form itself, but something that the original life form did while interacting with the earth. So trace fossils include tracks, so you might think of a dinosaur footprint. Burrows, so you might think of some type of mammal burrowing through the earth. Coprolites, which are fossils of animal feces, and gastroliths, which are fossils of what was contained within the digestive system of an organism. So this slide shows a really good example of all the different types of fossilization. So in photo A, you can see a picture of petrified wood. It was preserved by permineralization, and you can see that the bark and perhaps the tree rings to some extent, the structure of those were preserved in the petrified wood. And then in photo B, you can see an example of a mold and cast, where on the right you have the mold and on the left you have the cast. And then in example C, you can see a bee that was preserved as a carbon film. And then in example D, you can see fishes preserved as detailed impressions. So in this case, there probably used to be a carbon film, and that carbon film was eroded away, but you can still see the structure of the fish in the impressions. Example E shows a spider being preserved in amber. So it was probably crawling on a tree, and then that tree leaked some sap and trapped the spider, and then the sap ultimately formed into amber. And then example F is the gross example of a fossil, which is a trace fossil in this case, and is coprolite or fossilized dung. So now that we know all the different types of fossils, it's important to talk about the conditions that favor preservation of organisms, because that can teach us something about the geologic history of the Earth, or what was going on Earth when a particular type of fossil was created. It's important to note that the vast majority of organisms are not preserved. So our geologic record does not give us a perfect paleontological record. So for example, not every organism that's ever lived exists somewhere where conditions were favorable for preservation. Conditions that are favorable for preservation are rare and include rapid burial of an organism, and an organism possessing hard parts. Both of those increase the chances of preservation. So using fossils as well as the principles of relative dating allows us to correlate rock layers from different parts of the Earth with other rock layers, or determine that rocks in one location are part of the same formation as rocks in another location. So correlation involves matching rocks of similar ages from different regions, and it provides a more comprehensive view of the rock record overall. This slide shows a really good example of correlation between 3 different national parks in the southwestern United States. So you have the Grand Canyon, Zion National Park, and Bryce Canyon National Park in this case. And you can see that from this diagram that the upper 2 formations that exist in Grand Canyon National Park also exist in Zion National Park and are the lower 2 formations that are exposed. And in addition, the upper 2 formations that exist in Zion National Park are the same formations that are exposed as the lower 2 formations in Bryce Canyon. And so what this allows us to do is combine all of these rock records together from these 3 locations, and therefore span a lot greater of a time span in geologic time. So instead of only being able to understand what happened on Earth from the Precambrian to the beginning of the Triassic, which is what the Grand Canyon can tell us, we can get some insight into what happened in this area from the Precambrian all the way to the Paleogene, which is a much, much longer period of time within Earth's history. And piecing all of these together gives us a much better view of the history of this location from a geologic perspective. However, this method of correlation that was used in the last slide for the Grand Canyon and Zion National Park and Bryce Canyon can only work for within limited areas. And this is because rock formations only extend so far. As we discussed earlier in this lecture, you have the principle of original horizontality, but eventually every formation of rock is going to either grade into another formation of rock or sort of pinch out at the edge of a basin. And so to correlate over larger areas on Earth, for example, to correlate between the age of rocks somewhere in North America versus the age of rocks somewhere in Australia, you need to use fossils. So let's talk about how fossils can help us to correlate rock layers from different locations. So first off, the principle of fossil succession states that fossils are arranged according to their age. For example, trilobites existed on Earth before fish ever did, and fish existed on Earth before reptiles ever did, and reptiles existed on Earth before mammals ever did. So if you find a mammal fossil and you find a trilobite fossil, you can rest assured that the mammal fossil is younger than the trilobite fossil. Now, you might be wondering, on different continents on Earth, for example, we have different types of animals or biological organisms in general. So how can a fossil from one continent be used to correlate to another fossil from another continent? Well, there are two reasons that this is the case. The first reason is that at certain periods of time, all of the continents were connected with one another. We talked about Pangea earlier in this class, and so Pangea was a supercontinent when all the continents were the same landmass. So that's one reason, but another reason is that some organisms were so dominant that they existed virtually everywhere on Earth for a period of time. And those organisms in their fossilized form are known as index fossils and fossil assemblages. So index fossils are widespread geographically or all around the world and limited to a short period of geologic time. So you can use these to correlate a geologic layer in one part of the world with a geologic layer in another part of the world, no matter where you're at. And them being limited to a short period of time, or that organism only existing for a short period of time on Earth, is also very useful, because then you can tell, within a few million years, for example, that is the age of that rock. So let's continue to talk about fossils and correlating geologic units around the world. We already talked about index fossils, which are fossils of organisms that existed everywhere on Earth for a short period of time. Well, let's talk about fossil assemblages. Fossil assemblages are a group of fossils used to determine a rock's age. So usually it's better to have more than one fossil to determine a rock's age, just in case. And fossils also give us environmental indicators, because they can be used to infer information about past environments. And I sort of alluded to this earlier, but one good example is that shells of organisms can be used to infer positions of ancient shorelines and seawater temperatures, because we can analyze the shells of those organisms to determine seawater temperatures based off of what type of organism it was and also shells typically exist near shorelines in greater concentrations than they do offshore. So this slide shows some good examples of how to use fossil assemblages to correlate the age of rocks in different locations. So as you can see, when trying to figure out the age of rock unit B, which contains some fossils, you have some trilobites, some ferns, some clams or oysters, and some starfish. Well, we know the age of trilobites, or when trilobites existed on Earth, and we know the age, or we know the dates during which these other types of organisms existed on Earth. So if we sort of plot all of those ages on the right, then we can determine the age of rock unit B to, within a narrower amount of time than we could determine if we only had one fossil sample. So the area where trilobites and ferns and these shelled organisms and starfish all overlap is the blue area. So we know that that's the age of rock unit B. And then you can do the same thing for rock unit A, which also contains a maple leaf and the skull of what appears to be a reptile. And then you can use that information to narrow down the age of rock unit A. And then obviously the rock units in between B and A are between the age of rock units B and A. Okay, so that sort of concludes the lecture on relative dating. And you'll be doing some exercises in lab next week to learn how to date rock units relatively to one another. And this will really help you to understand a little bit more about Earth's history whenever you're looking at geologic formations that have multiple strata within them. So let's move on to numerical dating, or actually determining, within a certain level of uncertainty, the age and years of different geologic features or geologic strata. So to understand how we, as geologists, numerically date rocks, we need to go back and review a little bit about basic atomic structure, a little bit of a chemistry lesson. So if you recall, the nucleus of an atom contains protons and neutrons. Protons are the positively charged particles with mass, and neutrons are the neutral charged particles with mass, and electrons are the negatively charged particles that orbit the nucleus. The atomic number of an atom is the number of protons in its nucleus. So with all of that in mind, what is radioactivity, or a radioactive atom? Well, radioactivity is the spontaneous decay in the structure of an atom's nucleus. You can think of this as a type of atom or element that is unstable in its conditions, and therefore spontaneously decays in its structure. So there are multiple types of radioactive decay. There is alpha emission, which is when an alpha particle is 2 protons and 2 neutrons are ejected from the atom for it to try to reach a more stable form. And this reduces the atomic mass by 4 because both protons and neutrons are an atomic mass of 1. And it reduces the atomic number by 2 because, if you recall, the atomic number is the number of protons in the nucleus. Another type of radioactive decay is beta emission, and this is when a beta particle, an electron, is ejected from the nucleus of an atom as a neutron changes into a proton within the nucleus. And then the third type is electron capture. When an electron is captured into the nucleus, as a proton turns into a neutron within the nucleus. So this diagram shows examples of all three types of radioactivity and the changes that occur within an atom's nucleus when that radioactivity is occurring. So you're talking about changes within the nucleus that change the actual element that the atom is in an effort to reach a more stable state. And the reason why I've been talking about, this chemistry, the characteristics of the nucleus of an atom and radioactive decay, is that radiometric dating is how we get an age number for rock formations. Radiometric dating uses the decay of isotopes in rocks to calculate the age of a rock. And the way that we do this is using a half-life. A half-life is the amount of time required for half of the radioactive isotope to decay. So radioactive parent isotopes, or the isotope that originally exists, decay to stable daughter isotopes over time. And when the ratio of parent to daughter is 1:1, one half-life has passed. And that's because at that point, 50% of the atoms within that sample are now the more stable form rather than the more unstable form that is being decayed from, yielding the more stable form. So I'm going to go through a tutorial here which will demonstrate the changing from parent to daughter atoms and teach you about half-lives and how we actually numerically date the age of rocks using half-lives and radioactive decay. So I'm going to go through a tutorial here which will demonstrate the changing from parent to daughter atoms.
In terms of how many half-lives have gone by. And then we're going to use that to figure out how old rocks are.
And how we actually numerically
So there's several different kinds of radioactive decay. There's alpha particle emission, there's beta particle emission, and then there's even electron capture, which is essentially the opposite of beta emission. You don't really need to focus on the details here in this graph, but basically what we're looking at here are the many different steps that take us from an original parent isotope, uranium-238, and bring us to a stable daughter isotope, which is lead-206. We start off with 100% parent isotope, like uranium-238, and 0 daughter isotope, like lead-206. And as time goes by, we get less and less and less parent isotope, and that turns into more and more and more daughter isotope. The 50% point, when there's 50% of the parent that's decayed and produced 50% daughter, that amount of time that it takes to get there is called one half-life. If you let a second half-life elapse, that basically takes half of that 50 and turns that into daughter as well. So basically you go down to 25% parent and you now have 75% daughter. And then if you have that again, that's another half-life, more daughter accumulates, and then another half-life still takes half of the remaining parent and turns them into daughter. So more and more daughter accumulates over time. There are several different geologically useful isotope systems. Let's go ahead and look at an example here. Let's imagine we are going to make a crystal, and we're going to let uranium-235 into this crystal. Uranium atoms fit into the crystal lattice. They are happy there chemically, but the daughter product, lead-207, is not happy in the crystal lattice. So it might try and get in while the crystal's forming, but the crystal's not going to let it in because it doesn't fit there. However, because the uranium is already inside the crystal, some of it's going to decay over time to produce lead. And that lead is essentially trapped in the crystal as if it were like a baby born in jail. It just can't get out. The amount of time it takes for uranium-235 to turn into lead-207 is measured with a half-life of 704 million years. Now, in the image that we've got down there right now, we've got about 75% parent, that's the blue dots. We've got 25% daughter, that's the orange dots. So that ratio is about half of a half-life. So if 1/2 of a half-life has transpired, that means we need to multiply 704 million years by 1/2. So this crystal is 352 million years old. Let's let the system evolve a little bit further. Let some more of these parents decay into daughters, so we're building up more and more of the daughter product. At this point, we've got half of each, so 50% parent, 50% daughter. That's, of course, the definition of a half-life. So we multiply 704 times 1, and we get 704 million years. Okay, I think you get it. Let's try a different crystal now. We changed the color of our little cube here. We're going to switch isotope systems to uranium-238. Notice that it turns into lead-206 with a half-life of 4.5 billion years. If you take a look at the crystal here, you see 25% parent, 75% daughter. So let's do the math here. How many half-lives have gone by, and then you need to multiply that by 4.5. Well, hopefully you figured out that to have 75% daughter and 25% parent, that's 2 half-lives. And so you multiply 4.5 billion years by 2, and you get 9.0 billion years. Now, that's the correct answer for this problem, but that's not really a realistic number for any kind of rock you're likely to find on Earth because it's way too old. So the Earth is around 4.5 billion years old. Finding a rock that's 9 billion years old would be quite surprising indeed. Thanks very much for your attention. This has been another Smart Figure.
So this figure just shows several different types of radioactive isotopes that are commonly used in radiometric dating. So in the left column you can see the radioactive parent, or the original radioactive isotope. In the middle column you can see the stable daughter product that is formed after radioactive decay occurs. And then in the right column you can see the number of years that it takes for half of the radioactive parent atoms to decay into the stable daughter product atoms. So for example, for uranium-238, the half-life is 4.5 billion years, so that radioactive isotope is valuable for dating things that are extremely old. And then uranium-235, the half-life is 704 million years, so you might be able to get a more accurate date on something that's rather young with something like uranium-235. So it's kind of a complex process to actually numerically date something using radioactive isotopes. Because when you're determining the quantities of the parent and daughter isotopes, you must be precise. And some radioactive materials do not decay directly into stable daughter isotopes. So for example, uranium-238 has 14 steps of decay to ultimately decay to the stable daughter lead-206. And you might have guessed that something like that might go on, considering that having an atomic number of 238 is much different from having an atomic number of 206, and we never discussed any forms of radioactive decay that could just, shed 32 protons from the nucleus. That's a pretty huge change, obviously. So this figure actually shows you the steps in radioactive decay from uranium-238 to lead-206. So as you can see, it's quite a complicated journey, including both alpha emission and beta emission to get there. So when using radioactive decay to numerically date rock formation, it's really important to understand sources of error and the uncertainty of these dating techniques. First, it's important to keep in mind that you're making an assumption that the system must be closed. So what that means is that there's no external addition or loss of parent or daughter isotopes to the rock. So if you imagine that rock just existing in a vacuum by itself without interacting with any other parent or daughter isotopes of from other rocks. And as a result of this, fresh, unweathered rocks are ideal to use for radiometric dating. And fresh, unweathered rocks are typically not exposed at the surface of the Earth because, the surface of the Earth sees a variety of weathering forces, including water and wind. And so actually obtaining samples that you can use for radiometric dating can be challenging. So but nevertheless, we've been able to use radiometric dating techniques to find some of the oldest rocks on Earth. And all continents have rocks exceeding 3.5 billion years of age. This despite the fact that the age of Earth is only about 4.5 billion years old, as far as we know. And this is just sort of confirmation that geologic time is immense and that all of the continents on Earth are very old. So there's another radioactive isotope that I didn't mention previously that's commonly used in numerical dating, and that is carbon-14. So carbon-14 is used to date the most geologically recent events, and this is because the half-life of carbon-14 is only 5,730 years, which is much different than the hundreds of millions of years or billions of years that were the half-lives of the radioactive isotopes that I showed you earlier in this lecture. And as a result of this half-life, rocks containing carbon-14 can date events as old as 70,000 years, but also very young. So carbon-14 itself is produced or created in the upper atmosphere of Earth from cosmic ray bombardment, or basically from the sun and cosmic rays from the sun, such as UV, gamma rays, etc. I suppose not only from the sun, but also from other activity of other stellar bodies in space. And then after carbon-14 is created in this manner, carbon-14 is absorbed by plants through the process of photosynthesis, which many of you who've taken biology may remember that photosynthesis involves the plants the plants taking in carbon dioxide, and some of that carbon dioxide contains carbon-14. And so carbon-14 is very useful when trying to date organic matter because of this, because all organisms contain a small amount of carbon-14 because of photosynthesis. Now, another limitation of numerical dating is a limitation on sedimentary rocks. And you may or may not have thought of this yet, but sedimentary rocks can rarely be dated by radiometric means. And this is because sedimentary rocks are really just a bunch of pieces of sediment that have been eroded from other rocks that are then lithified into a new sedimentary rock. And therefore, if you're dating a sedimentary rock, what you're actually doing is dating the age of the particles within a sedimentary rock that may vary in age because they may come from different places. So as a result of this, geologists have to rely on igneous rocks to use numerical dating via radiometric means. And then relative dating techniques need to be applied to sedimentary rocks. So you're using a combination of the radiometric numerical dating and relative dating to determine the age of rocks throughout the geologic record. So let's look at an example, a real-world example of combining numerical dating or radiometric dating and relative dating to determine the age of these rocks to the best of our ability in this figure. So here we see a canyon that is exposed, a number of layers of rock, and you have several layers of sedimentary rock, and then you also have a layer of volcanic ash and an igneous dike. And so you can date the volcanic ash and you can date the igneous dike because those are both igneous materials, and therefore looking at radioactive decay in those materials is valid because they're not composed of sediment from potentially a variety of places. So if you date the volcanic ash at 160 million years old and you date the igneous dike at 66 million years old, then you can determine that the Somerville Formation and the Morrison Formation are older than 160 million years, and the Dakota Sandstone, the Mancos Shale, the Mesa Verde Formation, and the Wasatch Formation are all younger than 160 million years old. Then, if you use the igneous dike, which cuts through the Dakota Sandstone, the Mancos Shale, and the Mesa Verde Formation, then you can tell that the Mesa Verde Formation must be older than 66 million years because the dike cuts through that entire formation, and therefore the Mancos Shale and Dakota Sandstone must be older than 66 million years old. So we know all three of those formations are between 66 and 160 million years old. And that's how we get a pretty good estimate of the age of these sedimentary rocks, of the numerical age of these sedimentary rocks, despite the fact that we can't effectively use radioactive dating on them. So that's all that I have for you this week. Make sure to go over the geologic timescale in your textbooks because I did not cover that in this lecture because I had previously covered it in another lecture, but I think it's important for you to brush up on the geologic timescale so that you have some reference points when we're talking about the ages of geologic formation in millions of billions of years. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'll be posting on Blackboard about all of the assignments that are due this week, and I hope to talk to you in office hours. Thanks. Bye.